From the rolling vineyards of the countryside to the bustling streets of Chisinau, Moldova's history has often been shaped not just by kings, foreign rulers, and governments, but by the concentration of economic power in the hands of a select few. This pattern, sometimes referred to as economic royalism, describes how small elites, whether monarchs, aristocrats, or oligarchs, have held disproportionate influence over the economy and, by extension, society itself. In Moldova, this theme stretches back centuries. Long before modern politics, the land that is today Moldova was part of the Principality of Moldavia, a medieval state founded in the 14th century. Like much of Europe at the time, power was highly hierarchical. Land was the primary source of wealth, and it was concentrated in the hands of boyars, the noble class. These boyars held vast estates, worked by peasants who were tied to the land. The peasants produced grain, wine, and other agricultural goods, while the boyars collected rents, taxes, and loyalty. This system gave the Moldavian elites enormous power. The Prince of Moldavia, a hereditary monarch, often under the influence of regional empires, relied on boyars to support his rule, raise armies, and provide income. In return, the boyars enjoyed privileges that ordinary people could scarcely imagine. They lived in fortified manors, controlled trade routes, and even dictated the administration of justice on their estates. This early form of economic royalism created a society where a small minority held most of the wealth, while the majority lived in subsistence farming. But Moldavia was not isolated. Situated between powerful neighbors, the Ottoman Empire, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and later the Russian Empire, the region was often forced to pay tribute or concede territory. Economic royalism took on a new dimension as foreign overlords extracted resources. The Ottomans, for example, demanded tribute in grain, wine, honey, and livestock. Local elites often served as intermediaries, benefiting from the system while peasants shouldered the burden. The 19th century brought dramatic change. Following the Russo-Turkish Wars, much of modern-day Moldova came under Russian rule as the province of Bessarabia. Russian imperial administrators introduced new laws, but the basic structure of economic royalism remained. Large estates were still in the hands of nobles, both Moldavian boyars and Russian aristocrats who had been granted land as a reward for service. The majority of peasants were landless or trapped in debt, while landlords grew rich from exports of grain and wine to Russian and European markets. By the late 19th century, social tensions were growing. Peasant uprisings became more common as rural workers demanded relief from crushing taxes and land inequality. Intellectuals and reformers began calling for modernization and land redistribution. Yet, despite occasional reforms, the gap between elites and ordinary Moldovans remained wide. The First World War and the Russian Revolution in 1917 created upheaval across Eastern Europe. Bessarabia declared independence before uniting with Romania in 1918. Under Romanian rule, land reforms were introduced, redistributing estates to peasant families. For a time, it seemed that economic royalism might be broken. But while land was more evenly distributed, many new smallholders struggled with poverty, poor infrastructure, and lack of access to markets. A new elite emerged in the form of Romanian administrators and landlords, who often prioritized their own interests over local development. The Second World War and Soviet occupation transformed Moldova once again. After annexation by the USSR in 1940, the Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic was established. The Soviet system abolished private property and nationalized land and industry. On paper, this seemed like the end of economic royalism, as the old nobility and landlords were stripped of power. But in practice, wealth and influence were simply transferred to a new elite, the Communist Party officials. Collectivization reorganized agriculture into state and collective farms, and industrialization projects were launched. While these policies did modernize the economy to some extent, they also concentrated decision-making in the hands of a small bureaucratic class loyal to Moscow. Party leaders lived in privilege, with access to better housing, goods, and education. Ordinary Moldovans, meanwhile, often faced shortages, low wages, and restrictions on freedom. Economic royalism had changed form, but not substance. A small ruling elite controlled resources, while the majority had limited opportunities. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Moldova declared independence. The transition to a market economy was turbulent. State-owned assets were privatized, but instead of creating a broad middle class, much of the wealth fell into the hands of a few businessmen and political insiders. These new oligarchs amassed fortunes by controlling industries such as banking, agriculture, and energy. One of the most notorious scandals in modern Moldova was the disappearance of around $1 billion from the banking system in 2014, nearly one-eighth of the country's GDP at the time. The scandal highlighted how networks of elites, operating behind closed doors, could manipulate the economy for personal gain. For many Moldovans, it was yet another example of economic royalism in practice, the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a small circle. Today, Moldova remains one of the poorest countries in Europe, but the influence of elites continues to shape its path. Political parties often align with wealthy backers, and debates over corruption, transparency, and reform dominate national discourse. At the same time, many Moldovans have sought opportunities abroad, sending home remittances that sustain the local economy. In some ways, the departure of so many citizens is itself a symptom of economic royalism. When opportunities are limited at home due to elite control, ordinary people must look elsewhere. Yet Moldova is also a country in transition. Civil society groups, journalists, and reformers are working to hold elites accountable and push for more equitable development. Efforts to align with European Union standards on governance and transparency have opened new possibilities. The legacy of economic royalism, from medieval boyars to modern oligarchs, still looms large, but it is not the whole story. Looking back, Moldova's history reveals a consistent pattern. Economic power has often been concentrated, whether in the hands of princes, landlords, Soviet officials, or modern business elites. Each shift in political rule changed the names and structures of those in charge, but ordinary Moldovans often faced similar struggles. At the same time, periods of reform and resistance, from land redistribution to independence movements, show that this concentration of wealth has never gone entirely unchallenged. Understanding this history helps explain Moldova today. It is a country where vineyards still stretch across fertile hillsides, where traditions of hospitality and resilience remain strong, but where the shadows of concentrated power continue to shape daily life. Economic royalism in Moldova is not just a relic of the past, it is a thread that runs through centuries of history, connecting medieval boyars, Soviet officials, and modern oligarchs alike. And in the story of Moldova, it remains one of the most important forces to understand. Thanks for watching. Have you ever been to Moldova?